nice. And I hope that whatever legacy you have left us with, we are also able to carry it forward with the same momentum. I pray for that. Uh, Thank you very much,
Okay.
ma'am. It is now my very pleasant duty to briefly introduce the speaker for today, Professor Rajesh Narayanan. I will not take too long with this, but Dr. Rajesh Narayanan is actually originally from Mumbai. He did his BSc from Vivekanand College and his MSc, of course, from UDP. Passed out in the 1993 batch. He did his PhD in the University of Oregon in the USA. And after that, a string of postdoctoral fellowships at Oxford University in UK and in Germany at the Max Planck Institute for Complex Systems, as well as the Institute for Nanotechnology in Karlsruhe University in Germany. Subsequent to that, in the year 2006, he joined IIT Madras as an assistant professor. And during his tenure, which has been since then till date at IIT Madras, where he is now a professor, uh, he has had long-term visiting positions at Hong Kong University, at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, at the Zhejiang University in China, and at the Asia Pacific Center for Theoretical Physics. And he has been actively engaged in research, specifically in the applications of field theory applied to strongly correlated systems, with a focus on disorder and interactions and what is their effect on the low temperature behavior of quantum systems. And today, he will be addressing us, and I would invite him to deliver his talk on the topic of, I am sorry, on his topic for today, that is on the multifaceted role of quenched disorder in condensed matter systems. Without any delay, I would hand over the mic to Dr. Rajesh Narayanan. Please, mic is handed over to you, sir.
So thank you very much for kind introduction. It's great to be back home, at least virtually. So it's great to see Professor Rangwala, Professor Godbole, and Professor Varsha Bhattacharya in the audience. They have taught me. So in some sense, I'm very nervous to give this talk in front of people who have taught me. So it's almost a sort of a sort of an examination that, so I almost have a feel of being examined once again by these people. And believe me, it was not that much fun being examined by them. Being taught by them was great, but being examined by them was not so much fun. So I hope that this would be something that would be that would pass muster, even with people like Professor Rangwala and Professor Godbole, Professor Varsha Bhattacharya, and the rest of my colleagues from University of Mumbai, sorry. So what I'm going to do is to talk about something which is very dear to me. And the reason I've kept this at a level which is for students who are doing their MSc. And the idea is that maybe some of you students might get inspired and might want to come and work with us doing this sort of stuff at IIT Madras. Okay, so let me try to share my screen. So I need to know how to go to slideshow. So can everyone see this?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
It's clearly visible, sir.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is talk about the role played by quench disorder in condensed matter systems. And for people who are not experts in this field, what I mean by quenched means this is sort of disorder that is frozen in. Okay, so this is not moving around, and this will become clear as I go through the talk. But this is actually of quite a bit of importance. So the disorder is actually frozen in the time that is taken to do an experiment. And the condensed matter systems, I'm going to strictly speak about strongly correlated systems, and I'm going to talk about a particular sort of strongly correlated system, namely magnetic system. We have done some work on other systems in this genre, but I will not be talking about this in this talk. But I'll briefly mention it to you towards the end of my my talk. Yeah. So these are my collaborators, because of whom I could actually do this work. So Thomas Vojta, whom I've been collaborating with from the time I was a PhD student. He's at the Missouri University of Science and Technology right now. He's a professor there. Jose Hoyos is an an associate professor at the University of Sao Paulo in Sao Carlos. Professor Xin Wan is a professor at Zhejiang University, and we overlapped as postdocs at Karlsruhe. Sashikant is a former student of mine who graduated a year ago, and he is now a postdoc at Zhejiang University, but because of the COVID thing, he is back home, but he still continues to work with people at Zhejiang. Arnab is a young person who graduated from TIFI and now is an associate professor at the Indian Association for Cultivation of Science. Two people whom I don't have photographs for: Chong Zhu, who was a student of Xin Wan, and then moved on to industry, and Priyanka Mohan, who was a student of mine, graduated in 2014, is now is a postdoc at TIFR in the theory group. So what I'm going to talk to you about is about very simple things, so things that people can, students can understand. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about magnetic transitions. Okay, so I'm going to think about magnetic transition and the effect of disorder can have on these magnetic transitions. So before we start, essentially for people in the audience who are students, you know, I mean, you've seen phase transitions around, like for example, the liquid gas transition, which is supposed to be a first order transition when you are below the critical temperature Tc, right? So what characterizes this first order transition? Of course, you have phase coexistence, you have latent heat, right? And there's a discontinuous jump in the order parameter as you go through this phase transition. On the other hand, if you decide that you're going to sit at Tc and then approach the transition, then what happens is, of course, there's no more phase coexistence, there's no latent heat, and various thermodynamic quantities essentially show power law behavior. But of course, many students might want to ask, so what? What's so great about this power law behavior? So I'll come to that in a minute. So what are the examples of a first order transition? I mean, the most trivial example that one could think of, not a trivial, but standard example one could think of would be the liquid gas transition just below the critical point. And many magnetic transitions, when the applied field is essentially sent to zero, would essentially correspond to a second order transition. And other examples are superconductor metal transitions. And this list can go on. So what we are going to do is we are going to sit at Tc for, say, for example, the liquid gas transition, or take a magnetic system when the applied field is zero and study what happens to various thermodynamic observables as you go through the transition or in the vicinity of the critical point Tc. So for instance, you take some magnetic system like iron, you tune your temperature such that you're very close to the Curie temperature, and you ask what are the signatures of the transition, what are the signatures of the transition in various thermodynamic observables. So for instance, if I measure the magnetization, then the magnetization effectively behaves like a power law, right? It behaves as a power law and it's controlled by an exponent, and this exponent is what is universally called as beta, okay? So as a function of the distance to criticality, the magnetization vanishes coming in from the ordered state, and it vanishes as a power law, okay? This is well known in the study of magnetism, and this Tc for magnets is what is called as a Curie temperature, and in the case of generic transition, it would be called as a critical temperature. This is exactly what also happens even in liquid gas transition in the close vicinity of when you're at Tc. Sorry. In similar way, if you were to measure a response function like a susceptibility, then the susceptibility effectively also behaves like a power law. But in this case, as you come close to the transition, the susceptibility actually diverges as a power law controlled by an exponent gamma, okay? In similar fashion, I have not written down, if you look at this specific heat, the specific heat also diverges as you approach the transition, and it's controlled by another exponent alpha. Now suppose you are measuring this, the correlation between a spin sitting at site 0 and spin sitting at some site r, which is given by this function g of r. You know, when you're away from criticality, this object effectively goes like a exponential, and there is a scale that is set in this exponential function, and this is called as a correlation length psi. So what does this correlation length do? As you come closer and closer to the critical point, suppose you are sitting in a system of spins, then what happens is, as you come from low temperature phase, essentially some of the spins starts flipping, and then what you will have is these islands over which these spins are essentially correlated. So this psi essentially tells you about the size of the region over which the spins are actually correlated. Now, if you actually measure what this correlation length does, then this correlation length also diverges as a power law and is controlled by an exponent nu. In similar fashion, there is something called the correlation time. So essentially, imagine that you have these large islands and you try to flip these islands. So you flip these islands, and now the islands have to come back to equilibrium. It will take longer and longer time as you approach the critical point. That is because as you reach close to the critical point, these islands have grown, and then for these islands to come back to equilibrium, once you have flipped it, it will essentially have to talk with other islands, and then this would take longer and longer time, and this is what is called as a critical slowing down. This is actually a very important point for people who do numerical studies of phase transition. I will not get into this, but this is actually what is called as a critical slowing down. That means there's a time scale, and this time scale essentially diverges with an exponent z, and the divergence effectively is controlled by an exponent z, and it goes as psi to the power z, where psi is essentially the correlation length. The study of these second order transition essentially led to the concept of universality. And what is that? So effectively what it means is that these exponents, beta, gamma, nu, z, alpha, then there is something called eta, these exponents that characterize the behavior of thermodynamic observables essentially are the same irrespective of microscopic details. What do you mean by that? You can take two different systems that are described by two different microscopic Hamiltonians. But what happens is the critical behavior of both these systems, which are very, very different, right? Which are very, very different and can actually quantify very different transitions. They essentially are exactly the same, okay, irrespective of the microscopic details. So for a long, long time, effectively, this was not something that was understood. And finally, the puzzle essentially was put in its place by the work of many big physicists like Kadanoff, Wilson, Vidom, and Michael Fisher, and so on and so forth. So as a theorist, what one would do is essentially try to make a simple sort of model for this. So the simplest model that one can think of to actually solve this model is, or to understand phase transition, not solve, but to understand phase transition is what is called the Ising model. The Ising model is a very, very simple model. I mean, I think you must have, the students of course must have all learned about this in the statistical mechanics course. So this is one thing that I have to just say right now. I think all the experts will get terribly bored by my talk. This is actually going to be a very, very simple thing. So I'm really sorry. This was essentially made for the students. So I'm sorry for that. So now, what is the Ising model? The Ising model is a caricature model that describes or tries to capture the physics of phase transition. Okay. So what does this model entail? So of course, there's an energy function, which I call the Hamiltonian, which is given by essentially the interaction between the spins that are sitting on a lattice, and in this case, the lattice that I choose is a square lattice. Okay, the students might ask, why do I do this for 2D and not 1D? And the reason is that in one dimension, you can show that there is no phase transition at any finite temperature for a model with short range interactions. Okay, I can tell you about this much later, but you just have to take my word for it. So just assume that you have an Ising model where the spins are actually interacting with each other via the exchange interaction J, which I have taken to be ferromagnetic. Okay. the spins can either point up or down. That's it. It just takes values plus minus 1. Okay. So the ground state or the low temperature state of the system, so at the 0 temperature, effectively the ground state is either all the spins are pointing up or all the spins are pointing down. You get an energy gain by making all the spins point up or make all the spins point down. And as you go up in temperature, of course, the entropic effects kick in, and then you can essentially go into a state where the system essentially tends to gain energy by going into a disordered state. So to do that, what I do to capture this transition or to capture this transition from the disordered state where all the spins are pointing up or all the spins are pointing down, they are degenerate. These two states are completely degenerate to a state where all the spins are randomly aligned. What I do is I essentially write down something called the magnetization, which is M. And it's defined in a very simple manner. I essentially sum over all the spins sitting at site I. I divide by the number of spins, and essentially I ask whether this number is 0 or non-zero. So this is exactly that object which effectively went off to 0 in a power law fashion, right? So it's exactly the same thing. So you can actually exactly solve this model, and you can actually show that there is indeed a phase transition in this model. This was done a long time ago by Onsaga, and now it's a matter of textbook, and it's usually taught in many of the advanced statistical mechanics courses. The other option of dealing with this phase transition, or to understand where that universality that I talked about, where the various exponents are independent of the microscopic details of the model, to understand that, what the usual approach would be to write down an effective field theory for this. And what is this effective field theory written down in terms of? Usually what you do is you essentially look at what are the symmetries of this model. For example, the symmetries of the model is that the system is invariant if I take all spins up and pull it down, right? So that's a symmetry of the model. So phi going to minus phi, or sorry, m going to minus m in the language of the magnetization is a what is it called? Is a symmetry of the model. So what Landau did is essentially said that, look, I can write down a free energy by using the fact that near a phase transition, the magnetization is small. So what I will do is I will do an expansion around an expansion in this magnetization, and then I will ask, let me write down this free energy in terms of some of objects that respect the symmetries of the model. So which means in this case, the symmetry is that m going to minus m is a symmetry of the model. And then what effectively that means is all the odd terms should vanish, as you can see from here. And I truncate my series essentially at the magnetization, sorry, at magnetization to the power 6 sort of term. So I only keep magnetization to the power 4 sort of thing. And this u and this object u is deemed positive for stability reasons. Okay. So then the idea is, how do I account for fluctuations in the magnetization? So what happens is, as you heat up this magnet, then there are fluctuations, and these fluctuations can be local. And the question was, how do you deal with these fluctuations? And so Landau told us that what you do is you essentially write something which is grad m the whole square, and this is essentially consistent with the symmetries of the problem. And essentially what you get is what people in field theory would call a 5/4 theory. Okay, this T naught is nothing more than a distance to criticality, so it's T minus TC. So you have managed to write this down, and many of you might have solved this in a particular approximation called mean field approximation. But you can show that this mean field approximation only works for dimensions greater than 4, and so on and so forth. And if you really want to do this, to actually solve this model, then you have to lay recourse to what Wilson did, which is what is called the renormalization group. The renormalization group in itself is a vast topic that I'm not going to get into over the period of a 45-minute talk. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip over it and tell you that you can actually do this. And for students, this is actually one of the best places where you can actually read about renormalization group. It's this review by Wilson and Kogut from 1974. That's where I learned renormalization group from, because my advisor made me do that when I was a PhD student. And of course, he gave lectures too. And I think this is the best thing to do. So irrespective of that, of actually going and reading this thing, all you have to take from this here is that this concept of universality, the fact that you have power loss at the critical point and so on and so forth, comes or can be proved by using this RG approach. Okay. So now the simple question that I want to ask the first thing is, suppose I start looking at realistic systems, realistic magnets that are prepared, say, in Professor Varsha Bhattacharya's lab, right? How, how does realistic physics actually change the behavior that we actually predict by using this field theoretic method I've just basically outlined? So for instance, what you're doing is you're making a magnet in your lab, and when you're making a magnet in your lab, then you cannot guarantee that the sample that you're making is pure, right? So essentially what I'm asking is, if there are some impurities in the model, suppose somehow while making the sample, some non-magnetic impurities come into the sample, how does this affect the behavior near the phase transition? So the question that I want to ask is whether addition a small amount of disorder of impurities, which I call disorder, essentially kills the transition, kills the ordered phase, and or whether something else happens. So this is a very important question that people were asking from the 70s. Okay, so the answer to that can be essentially explained by a means of very heuristic arguments. So let's look at what I mean by that. So this is our model again. This is the Ising model, but I have removed the spins for clarity. So a simple model of a disordered system could be that you have spins sitting again on a lattice, but the interactions between the spins, right, are random. They take values either J1 or J2. So either the blue bonds or the red bonds. That means the interaction strength, the SISJ strength that is sitting over here, can take values J1 or J2 depending on whether it's a blue bond or a red bond. Okay. So what is happening is that some impurities have come into the system when you're making the sample, and this sample weakens certain bonds and the other bond is left unaltered. Okay. So this is a very simple way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is another equivalent thing that could have happened is you're making the sample, but in the preparation of the sample, some of these spins gets replaced. So instead of having spins sitting there, you have vacancies. It's actually very equivalent sort of problem. So if you do this, the question is, if you have some weak bonds and some strong bonds, does the phase transition survive? And if it does survive, what are the exponents and how does the exponents depend on the disorder? Okay, how does it depend upon the amount of disorder that you have in the sample? So this was a problem that was actually looked at in the 70s. And what they did was, so this is Harris. So what Harris did is he looked at how does the effective field theory look like. So you remember we had written down a field theory, which is a 5-4 theory. In similar fashion, you get a 5-4 theory for this model too. You can actually derive this in glorious detail, but I'm not going to do that. But what does happen is the distance to criticality, delta T naught, essentially gets modulated. So what is happening is that in some regions there are an excess of red bonds, and some regions there are an excess of blue bonds. So the excess of blue bonds is a system where there is really no disorder present, so it's effectively like a clean system. The excess of red bonds is like essentially where there are a lot of disorder present. So what is happening is that the distance to criticality in these regions actually change. So as a function of distance, as a function of position, the distance to criticality gets modulated. It's randomly modulated. So this is what is called as a random TC model, or people who are doing field theory will call it a random mass model. Okay. So now the question is, what does the phase transition in these models, in this model look like? So of course, one can do renormalization group and all these very sophisticated tools to figure out the answer to that question. But we don't have to do that. There's very simple heuristic criteria, heuristic way of deriving what is called the Harris criteria. So what is this Harris criteria and what is the physics behind it? So what happens is, suppose you take a large system of size L, right? Then what happens is, because of disorder, the system breaks up into small mesoscopic boxes. Within each mesoscopic box, there is a different concentration of disorder. And because of a different concentration of disorder, the critical temperature is different within each box. That's what I call by means of this TC1, TC2, TC3. There are different critical temperatures, and each of these TCs are actually kind of different from each other. It can also be the same, but doesn't matter. They are actually different from each other, and that difference comes because of the concentration of impurities in these boxes. Okay. Now we ask, by how much is this TC different in each of these boxes? And then effectively what you do is you essentially make a recourse to things that you know from random numbers. So in each of these boxes, there are essentially these random variables Jij, and in this random number Jij are uncorrelated random numbers, and you know that the variance of this guy is essentially goes as 1 over square root n. That means that this delta T, that's the variance of this critical temperature, and this variance is with respect to the global critical temperature. This goes as 1 over root n. So 1 over root n, if you write in terms of psi, then it goes as some correlate from some psi to the power minus d by 2. Now suppose there is a global critical temperature. If there's a global critical temperature, then effectively what I do is I know that as I'm close to the critical point, I know that the correlation length goes as T minus Tc to the power minus nu. Remember, we have seen that before. This essentially means that I can convert this difference T minus Tc in terms of a global correlation length, which is psi to the power minus 1 by nu. Now, it's obvious that if this delta T is less than T minus Tc, then all the blocks are in the same phase. But if delta T, this deviation from this local deviations in critical temperature, if it is greater than T minus Tc, then you know what happens is some of the blocks are in the ordered state and some of the blocks are in the disordered state, which means that if delta T is greater than T minus Tc, you cannot really have a homogeneous transition. Okay. But what we are going to ask for is that the entire system essentially goes through a transition at one critical temperature, which means that delta T should be less than T minus Tc. And if you then compare the psi to the power minus 1 by nu to the psi to the power minus d by 2, then you get a condition that nu should be greater than 2 over d. Okay, this is the Harris criteria. So what does the Harris criteria say? The Harris criteria says that if the correlation length exponent actually satisfies the equality that nu should be greater than 2 over d, then that means that the critical behavior or the exponents remain unchanged by disorder. So disorder has no effect on the exponents if this Harris criterion, which is nu is greater than 2 over d, is satisfied. If it is not satisfied, then the criterion doesn't say anything. But what usually happens is you usually go through a new transition where the critical exponent now satisfies this, the new critical exponent satisfies this 2 over d, or there are cases where the disorder essentially changes the form of the scaling between, changes the critical behavior from this sort, which is called the power loss sort of behavior, to something called the activated scaling behavior. We'll come to that in some time. Or disorder can be strong enough to actually kill the transition, smear the transition. Okay, so this is what Harris criterion said. This sort of disorder is called as weak disorder. Why is it called weak disorder? Is because it doesn't do anything. It doesn't do anything to the phases. The disorder essentially retains the phases. That is, there is an ordered phase where the magnetization is non-zero, and a disordered phase or a high temperature phase where the magnetization is 0. Okay. So this was the Harris criteria, and this is actually stuff in the 70s. Now, of course, all of this depends upon the sort of disorder you put in. So for example, when you're making your sample, it can so happen that what comes in as impurities may be spin impurities, or right, magnetic impurities. And if this magnetic impurities that are coming in, then this is what is the Drosophila example. Drosophila is the fruit fly, right? I mean, this is what the biologists actually use to study this this nerve network in things. So that's like the model system for them. For us, this is a model system to study you know, what happens when you have spin impurities in system. So the Ising model is a Drosophila model for all of phase transition spins. So now let's look at this this model where what happens is you have magnetic impurities present. So now when your magnetic impurity is present, this is where essentially the magnetic impurity essentially produces a local magnetic field, and this local magnetic field is effectively random, and that's what is given by the red term there. Okay. Now this HIs are the random field. Now obviously in cases where this W, which is the width of the distribution of the H fields, are very, very large, right? Very strong random fields are present. Then obviously the system will essentially break up into domains, right? So what the system will do is that locally the magnetization will like to follow the direction of the local random field if the field is very, very strong. So for that case, what happens is when the local random fields are very, very large, it just breaks the system into domains. There's no magnetic order. So essentially the magnetic transition is also destroyed because there's no magnetic order, right? So it's all in the disordered phase. But the question that you want to ask is not that. The question that you want to ask is, what would happen if this W is small? Okay, if it's much smaller than J, for instance, you can ask the question, what would happen? Is a long range ordered state still possible? And one would actually think that yes, why not? I mean, why shouldn't it be? So to do that, effectively, this was solved by Imry and Ma a long time ago, right? Very long time ago. And the effective idea again is a heuristic argument. You can essentially you can do more sophisticated treatments, but you have to be careful because the most sophisticated treatments can actually give some weird results. So the sort of thing that you would like to look at is, suppose I have a bulk ordered phase, and suppose the bulk ordered phase is down, right? Now, the question that you want to ask is whether the system would like, so now the question that you want to ask is, suppose in this bulk ordered phase, I essentially put a region which is pointing in the opposite direction. And you can ask the following question, will the system like to break up into domains? And that, of course, the question can be answered by essentially comparing the energy gained by essentially trying to align with respect to the field, with respect to the random field. And if you align with respect to the random field, as you can see over here, then you actually see that there is a domain wall cost to be paid. So now, obviously, the point is that you want to compare the domain wall cost, and that essentially is something that goes as L to the d minus 1. And that's obvious that it should be L to the d minus 1 because every bond that is broken, for example, across the domain wall costs you some energy 2J, and then this L to the d minus 1 is the number of spins that are sitting on the perimeter. That's all. And in similar fashion as we have done for the case of the Harris criterion, you ask what is the gain in the energy if you essentially align across the field, and that effectively from again central limit like theorem, you essentially can compute as it goes as L to the power d by 2. Now, of course, you have to match the L to the d by 2 versus L to the d minus 1, and you can actually show that such a state where the system breaks up into domains is always going to be the case when the dimension d is less than 2. Because what in dimensions d less than 2, you will actually see that domain formation essentially, you would like to break up into domains and pay the energy cost that is related to domain wall, because that's what you gain energy by doing that. Whereas in d greater than 2, there is always a possibility that you can still have an ordered state. Okay, so this sort of disorder, which is called random field disorder, is going to be much more stronger. So now what we are going to do is the first example of something that we have done a couple of years ago, and this was done with Sashi. So the sort of model that I'm going to look at, and this is a very important model because of applications to things like high TC superconductors and various other applications. So because of lack of time, I'm not going to talk about this for the time being. So let's look at this. Let's look at this model. So this is exactly the Ising model, but in this case, there's a new wrinkle. So the Ising model only had this object J1, which are nearest neighbor interacting spins, right? Now what I'm going to put is put a little wrinkle, just a small wrinkle, and that small wrinkle effectively is that I add next nearest neighbor interactions. But in this case, the next nearest neighbor interaction, J2, are ferromagnetic, sorry, anti-ferromagnetic. That means they like the next nearest neighbor spins, they essentially anti-align with respect to each other. The question is, what is the phase diagram of this model? Now, one would think, people who are not in the field would think that this is actually going to be quite trivial. But the problem is that the moment you put this next nearest neighbor interaction, all the nice features of exact solvability of the Ising model goes out of the window. So the only thing one could have done, and only thing one did, was actually do numerics, which is some sort of Monte Carlo simulation. So let's have a look at the phase diagram. What sort of phase diagram that you get? So this is a phase diagram that you have. The phase diagram has temperature on one axis, or temperature scaled by J1 on one axis, and the ratio J2 by J1 on the x-axis. Now, when J2 by J1 is small, that means when the ferromagnetic interaction actually wins, then of course you would expect that there should be a magnetic, ferromagnetically ordered phase. So that's what is called as a ferromagnetic ordered phase. Okay. Then as you keep on increasing J2 by J1, essentially what the system tries to do is to take advantage of the fact that as you increase J2, only half of the lattice points sorry, takes advantage of inherent frustration in the system and then breaks up into domains. What do I mean by domains? I mean, if you look on the left-hand side of this view graph, you essentially have things where the system essentially gets ordered in either horizontally ordered stripes or vertically ordered stripes. So this is not something that is unique only to this frustrated model. There are other systems, for example, as I said, the superconducting problem, where you see such stripes. So these stripes essentially break the symmetry of the square lattice, and essentially you can have 4 such configurations, and these 4 configurations essentially are what are called the stripe phase on the right-hand side of your view graph. Sorry. Now, what is the phase transition between these models? So you have to notice that this model was only completely understood in 2013. Okay, so that's quite a bit of time, right? And the only wrinkle you have added is this anti-ferromagnetic interaction, next nearest neighbor anti-ferromagnetic interaction. So now there's a transition between the ferromagnetic phase to the paramagnetic phase, and it's a usual Ising-like transition which we had actually seen before. Now, what about the transition between the stripe and the paramagnetic phase? So very serious numerics, very high precision numerics conducted by Jin, Arnav, and the group of Anders Sandvik essentially showed that the transition from the stripe phase to the paramagnetic phase is kind of weird. And why is it weird? Because in between these points A and B, the transition is first order, and then there's a tricritical point, and then the transition is essentially a second order transition, but belonging to a very special class called the Ashken-Teller class. Now, the Ashken-Teller class is essentially some n-coupled sort of Ising models. In this case, n equals 2, and it's a very interesting problem, because the general n thing is actually related to what is called the Gros-Neveu model. Okay, so just for students, just keep this in mind. But what is interesting is the critical exponent nu, for instance, is actually continuously varying across this phase boundary. So that's a very interesting sort of phase transition, because that's a very interesting sort of phase transition, and it took at least until 2013 until the state of the art of this phase diagram was achieved in this very nice paper and a PRL preceding that. So now the simplest question that we want to ask is, what does disorder do to this model, right? So this is the model. So the disorder that we have actually going to put in is modeled as vacancies. So either there is a spin sitting there or not, and that depends upon some probability distribution. Okay, so in particular, what we are going to do is to look at what is called an order parameter for the stripe phase, which is some sort of a staggered order parameter that we have written down over here. And we are going to ask, oh look, now let's measure this order parameter and see what happens to the transition in the presence of these impurities. So here is what it is. So here is the stripe order parameter as a function of temperature. Now what we do, this is a Monte Carlo simulation that my student Sashi did in his PhD thesis. And what you do is you sit at the stripe ordered phase, and then what you write down, or you simulate the system using a simple Metropolis thing, and you measure the order parameter and you plot this for various different system sizes for some impurity concentration. So we have done it for even smaller impurity concentration, but let's just do this for this particular impurity concentration. What you see is something very interesting. What you see is that as you increase the system size, so that the lowest system size is the red curve, the largest system size is the pink curve. As you increase the system size, the magnitude of the order parameter, which is given by psi square, actually keeps decreasing. Okay, actually keeps decreasing. So this is actually a very, very bad, because what you would have expected is, irrespective of the system size, this should have got stuck at some value. Okay. The second thing that clued us that there was something really terrific going on here was the following fact, that when we looked at the susceptibility, so remember the susceptibility we said should diverge at the critical point. So here is a divergence, and if you don't see the divergence, that's because we are working with finite size systems. The system size cuts off the divergence, right? So you see a peak. Instead of seeing a divergence, you should just see a peak. But over here, what you see is not a peak. So you see a peak, but you see a secondary peak at low temperatures. Now this is actually strange, because you don't know what's happening to the system at low temperatures, and the secondary peak at low temperatures actually become harder. Sorry, not harder, but more prominent as you increase the system size. Okay, so this essentially caught us wondering, because what we thought was actually just putting in vacancies would just change the universal class of the phase transition. And so lo and behold, we see something which is very, very interesting, and we started figuring out what is going wrong over there. So what we figured out is the following thing. Suppose you take the square lattice with the next nearest neighboring interactions J1 and J2 put in, and concentrate on a placket. So while you're disordering the system, what happens is there are certain configurations that turn up where two vacancies either populate a nearest neighbor vertical bond or a nearest neighbor horizontal bond, right? So when it populates a near neighbor vertical bond, what happens is it actually seems to like those stripe configuration that are vertically aligned. So this is simple energetics. You can actually calculate it and show it. In similar fashion, if you actually look at near neighbor horizontal bonds that are occupied by vacancies, then this seems to prefer effectively those stripe configurations which are horizontally aligned. So what is happening is such configuration is ending up biasing the field, biasing the system to choose out of the 4 degenerate configuration to choose 2 of them. This is precisely in similar analog to what we have seen for the random field magnet, where the occurrence of a random field essentially makes the system choose to either align up or down depending on the direction of the random field, right? Here, of course, it is trying to, it is forcing the system to bias itself to either pick the horizontally aligned stripe or the vertically aligned stripe. So effectively what happens is that the presence of the vacancies, which is thought to be in purely random mass sort of or random TC sort of model, effectively generates a random field. And this random field comes because of these rare configurations that I'm talking about. Now, what that does is it essentially breaks the system into domains. And that's exactly what is shown in the bottom right panel here, where the system is essentially broken up into domains, and essentially you have lost long range order. So the presence of these impurities effectively can kill stripes. Okay, so the interplay of impurities or vacancies and order parameters that break a real space symmetry, like the stripe order parameter, essentially leads to the generation of a random field. And this random field effectively destroys the phase transition, because it destroys, no, not a phase transition, but the phase, the stripe ordered phase. And that was a very important result. Okay. So now, of course, you ask the following question: will this survive if you essentially have some sort of anti-correlation in the impurity? So a physical way of thinking about it is, suppose you take your model or your experimental system and you start doping it. But suppose the dopants, the atoms are so large that it does not allow the occupation of its nearest neighbor. So you're doping with non-magnetic impurities, which is like a vacancy, and then as modeled as a vacancy. And then suppose you put one of those dopants randomly, then the dopant is so large that it doesn't allow another similar dopant to sit in its nearest neighbor. Okay, that's what we call as anti-correlated disorder. So we actually did the numerics for this. So let's compare the two things. So on your left, you actually see the effect when you have anti-correlated disorder, as I have told you very clearly. See the stripe order parameter goes down with increasing system size. On the right, we have anti-correlated impurities, where these dopants cannot sit in nearest neighbor sites. And in that case, the magnetic order is surviving. Okay. In similar fashion, if you look at, say, the susceptibility, you know that if you put in the anti-correlated disorder, the phase went away, as evidenced by the secondary peak coming in the susceptibility. And in the case of stripes, in the stripe ordered phase with anti-correlated disorder on your right, on the bottommost part, right-hand corner, you actually see that the secondary peak has disappeared, essentially saying that the phase survives. So how does a phase transition look like? How does a phase diagram now look like? So here is a phase diagram. So the black lines are essentially from the clean case. And now in the case of the anti-correlated disorder, of course, you have a phase with Z2 symmetry, which is the ordinary ferromagnetic phase. And then you have the phase with Z4 symmetry that has come back because of putting in anti-correlation. And this small thing down there is a spin glass phase, which we don't know whether it exists or not. So that's a purely speculation. We will do some more work on this once we get some time. But in the case of just purely uncorrelated disorder, then the entire Z4 ordered state is gone. The Z2 state, which is the ferromagnetic state, which doesn't break the symmetries of the crystal, that still remains. And now the last thing that you want to ask is, what are the universality classes of the phase transition? This we have shown to be of the disordered Ising class. Okay, so this is what we have actually done in the last couple of years. So how much time do we have?
You can take 10 more minutes or so, sir. No problem. Even more. Okay. Not a problem.
Okay, then fine. Then let me. Okay, so this is so far what we have been talking about is purely what is called as is purely classical sort of transitions. That means this happens at finite temperature, right? But many of you students must, at least who are interested in condensed matter theory, must have at least heard of this new thing, which is what are called as quantum phase transition. So disorder effects can be extremely severe near quantum phase transitions. So let me tell you what exactly this quantum phase transition is. Okay. So what you see over here is a very relevant example of such a thing. This is a phase diagram of something called a cerium copper gold. So as you, so essentially what you can do is you can go from an ordered state to a disordered state by essentially doping the sample, right? So instead of just taking a system and heating it up to go through a phase transition or go through the Curie point, what you're going to do is sit at a very low temperature and change doping. Okay, so for example, take cerium copper and dope it with gold, and essentially go from an ordered state to a disordered state. Such transitions that happen at zero temperature as a function of this doping or some non-thermal parameter like doping. The other thing that you could do is take a superconductor, put it in a magnetic field, right, at low temperatures, and then of course the magnetic field essentially will allow you to go from a superconductor to a metal or an insulator transition. So such transitions where things are controlled, or the transition is controlled by a non-thermal non-thermal control parameter, is what is called as a quantum phase transition. We can spend an entire colloquium on quantum phase transition, but let me just tell you some of the basic stuff. Okay, so the essential idea, for example, in this problem would be that by changing the doping, what you're doing is essentially changing the triplet interaction, which I say call gamma T, between the spin density, that essentially controls the interaction between spin densities. Okay, that is what is given in the expression S equals S naught plus gamma T dx theta nsx tau nsx tau. So nsx tau is essentially a spin density term. Gamma T is controlled by X, or in systems where you drive it by pressure, gamma T is controlled by that object. Okay, it's some interaction string, okay, for the time being. S naught is everything else that that is not related to the magnetic transition. So you lumped it all into what is called S naught. You can at this level, only at this level, you can think of this as non-interacting electrons. Okay, don't worry. So think of electrons hopping on a lattice. So that's effectively just the free electron part of the action, nothing more than that. So a typical way that one deals with this is to write down an order parameter theory, just like what we did in the previous section. And there's a very set way of deriving such an order parameter theory, and was told to us in these set of very lovely papers by Hertz and Millis. Okay. So this paper, this is effectively effectively exactly like the 5-4 theory that we have written down. This can be derived. It is derived essentially in the paper by Hertz, but let's not worry about how you derive it. Okay. So phi is an order parameter. In this case, it should be the staggered magnetization. In the case of ferromagnet, it's the case of ferromagnet, it is it's the ordinary magnetization. In the case of a superconductor insulator transition, for instance, which is controlled by say a magnetic field, that could be the superconducting order parameter. So phi essentially plays the role of an order parameter. Now let's compare with what we have seen. For example, we have seen some time ago this this model of the free energy in the classical description of the Ising model. So it was exactly a 5-4 theory. So this is also a 5-4 theory. But the important point over here is that there is an addition of another dimension. And that dimension is what is called as imaginary time given by d tau, or the Fourier transform given by omega n. Where does this come from? This comes from essentially thinking of the Boltzmann factor e to the minus h over kBt as a time translation operator. So you can make this mapping very exact, and you can do a proper technical analysis. But effectively, the thing is that you map 1 over temperature to an imaginary time. Okay, so this tau is an imaginary time. So effectively, if you compare the classical model, which is given by f phi versus s, then the only difference that is there in both of these objects is the presence of this d tau. So you would think that the only difference between these two, at least at the level of the free energy functional, is that it has gone from d to a d plus 1 model. But actually, you can show that it's actually not d plus 1, but it's d plus z, which is z is a dynamical exponent. So this is a very famous theory, which says that any d-dimensional quantum transition can be mapped on to a d plus z classical transition. Okay, so that's essentially it. Now, this mapping to imaginary time is actually very, very important for us. Okay, I'll tell you why this is important for us. So now let me see. So why is this important for us? Will become very clear when, or not, will become more obvious as we go into the disordered model. So this is exactly the model that I've written down earlier. And now you can ask, say for example, what would happen if you take a real magnetic system as we had seen before, and you essentially dope it. When you dope it, what happens is there will be again clumps formed, right? Where where there is large amount of disorder, and there are some areas which are essentially disorder free, right? Again, you have a distance to criticality, which is now this delta naught, right? Which is changing from place to place. Another thing that can happen, so is that disorder can effectively get transferred by some sort of a RG process into the object gamma, and this object gamma essentially controls the strength of the dissipation. Now the question is, where does the dissipation come from? This comes from the fact that what you're doing when you write down such a model is you take your microscopic model and you integrate the fermions out, or the electrons out. You do that because it is very difficult to work with the fermionic theory. So you write things in terms of this bosonic object phi, right? Now when you integrate all the fermions, this essentially leads to a dissipation term. So this mod omega is essentially a dissipation term. This comes from integrating out the fermions. Okay. Now the point is, because of disorder, gamma, psi naught, delta naught, these become functions of position. So it varies from point to point in space. Okay. So now the question is, how do you deal with such problems? And what are examples of such problems? So let me show you one particular example. And this is an interesting material called nickel vanadate. So, this is not the only example that is there for the sort of things that I'm going to talk about. Okay, but this is one of the earliest examples, and this is a PRL from 2010. There is a follow-up PRL recently in 2017, and there are certain superconducting materials which also show similar behavior. Now, what happens here? So over here, what you do is you take nickel and you dope it vanadium. The doping it vanadium essentially sees to it that the critical temperature essentially crashes down almost to zero. Now you ask, so that's the phase diagram of nickel vanadium, and now you ask yourself, all right, let's see what happens if I measure, say, if I measure, just a minute, if I measure things like the susceptibility. So what I'm going to do is I essentially sit around the disordered phase that is essentially controlled by this object X. X is the amount of vanadium that you have put into the system, and you are asking yourself, let's look at thermodynamic quantities like susceptibility. Now we know from our theory of phase transition that only at the critical point will this essentially diverge as a power law and all that sort of very nice things, right? Now what happens is, if you measure the susceptibility of this object, then in the in the disordered phase, essentially what you see is that between 10 and 100 Kelvin, the susceptibility essentially behaves in an anomalous fashion. In other words, the susceptibility actually diverges, which is controlled by an exponent gamma, but this exponent gamma is non-universal. What do you mean by that? It means that this gamma actually depends upon the concentration that you are at, this vanadium concentration that you are at. Similar feature is also shown by the field dependent magnetization. Once again, it is described by this very weird power law. Okay, and again the problem is that this power law is actually depends on where exactly in your phase diagram you are, on what disorders, not disorder, but what concentration of vanadium you are at. This gamma actually sensitive to that. So this is of course completely very different from the sort of physics that we have been talking about, where you said, this objects gamma and so on and so forth are actually functions of actually some universal number, right? So so what happens at lower temperatures is of course something completely different. I will come to that later, maybe. Okay. So the sort of model that we are cooking up is this sort of disordered version of the Hertz model. And to make things easy to do a particular variant of renormalization group called the strong disorder renormalization group, what people do is essentially rewrite it in terms of a semi-discretized model, where you discretize it in space and then in imaginary time you let it run to all to infinity. I mean, you discretize in real space, but omega n is left undiscretized. So Matsubara frequency is left really undiscretized. So this is effectively how the model. So this model was written by Hoyos, Kotbaje, and Boita, and how they are related to the original Hertz model is it's a large N adaptation of the original Hertz-Willis models. Okay, it's not important right now because I'm not going to use that too much. But what I want to say is that exact treatment is possible. So what causes this? This anomalous behavior that we saw in the previous slide. So what is caused is because of what are called rare regions. What are these rare regions? So what happens is if you have a magnetic system, in certain regions the system is relatively clean. So as you tune the system to its critical point by doping or whatever, these regions will order faster. Now, when they order faster, they essentially are like giant magnetic moments sitting in a bulk matrix, which is completely disordered, right? But these giant magnetic moments are not ordered by itself. They can essentially fluctuate. And the mod omega term that you saw over there essentially gives you a dissipation. Now, in usual classical systems, such things actually don't give a very important configuration. But for quantum models, this actually gives a very important contribution. And why is that? The reason behind this is, as you're at low temperatures, this thing has a finite extent in real space. But this model, so what happens with disorder and quantum phase transition is the disorder gets perfectly correlated in imaginary time dimension because of near a quantum phase transition. Okay, so they have become perfectly correlated in imaginary time. So what happens is they are of finite extent in real time, in real space, but of infinite extent in imaginary time. And that's what I have drawn in the right hand side. Okay, so as temperature T goes to 0, this becomes like these large, big rods, right? Now imagine that you try to gauge the response of these rods. So you try to flip the spins on this. Now, of course, this flipping behavior is going to be very, very slow, right? Extremely slow. And this is actually the reason why you get this anomalous behavior. So let's see how this anomalous behavior comes, okay, in a very simple sort of hand-waving argument. So the simple sort of hand-waving argument can be written in terms of this one such rod, right? The probability of finding such a rare region, of course, is exponentially small. I mean, you can do a calculation in the back of the envelope and you can show that it's exponentially small. Now, what about the object epsilon I, which is essentially a renormalized distance to criticality on that blob? That again you can show is exponential in the system size. The L is the size of the system in real space. Okay, so now the point is, if you look at the distribution of such islands, if it's not the distribution of islands, but the distribution of this renormalized distance to criticality, then you can show that this goes as a power law. Effectively, it is these two exponentials, that is the exponential that is related to the distance to the distance to criticality and the exponent that is related to probability of finding the rare region. They essentially play with each other, and the distribution of this distance to criticality, which has now become random because of introduction of disorder, becomes a power law. Hello. Hello.
Hello, sir.
I think something happened. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Sir, around 5 more minutes.
I will finish in 5 more minutes. Don't worry.
Okay, sir. Yeah, thank you, sir.
They essentially become a power law. Now, of course, you can make a very simple argument about the susceptibility. How do you make the argument? Now, look at each of these blobs. Each of these blobs really reminds you of a single spin sitting somewhere. What should be the response of a single spin? It should be that of a Curie thing, right? I mean, so there's a 1/temperature response that comes from a Curie thing of an individual spin sitting, large spin sitting somewhere. So that's a 1/temperature. And then you have to essentially essentially weighted by the distribution of such distribution of the distance to criticality, and that's what I've done over here. And the entire thing at any finite temperature is cut off by a temperature. That's a lower cutoff. Okay, don't forget about the upper cutoff for the time being. You immediately do this integral, and what you see is that you get a power law, which I have written over here. And now the interesting thing is this power law, the exponent is actually controlled by this object C and C prime, which are in fact dependent on the disorder concentration. So this is what exactly happens in these systems. Of course, this is a very heuristic argument, but you can do much better than this heuristic argument. You can do much better than this heuristic argument. In fact, you can do a very nice strong disorder RG, and you can actually show that this this model effectively has what is called as infinite randomness fixed point. And at the infinite randomness fixed point, the critical behavior is no longer power law-like, but activated. And the Griffiths effects that you saw with this continuously varying exponents and so on and so forth are effectively due to these rare regions, and also because and stems from having this infinite disorder fixed point that controls the phase transition. So this was done by Thomas Vojta and company, Thomas Vojta and his collaborators in 2007 and 2009. It's a PRL and a very nice PRB. And we have also done similar work again with Thomas, Jose, and Priyanka. And what happens, say for example, if you have dissipation which is super ohmic, and this is this is related to some work that was done with Josephson junction arrays that are grown over a substrate, and there is disorder in the system, and then people found that you should have Kostelis Thouless-like transition. I forgot to put the reference to work by Altman and Raphael, and we had extended that work for any dissipation string. Okay, so what we have learned from this thing is that from this talk is that disorder, which many people, especially people who grow crystals and things like that, might think is a bugbear, is very undesirable, can essentially have great effects, very exotic effects. They can kill transitions. They can change the critical behavior, like in the Harris criterion. We can use that as a knob to control what sort of ordered states that can come through. That's what we did when we put anti-correlated disorder versus correlated disorder in the J1, J2 model, right? The stripe phase went away for uncorrelated disorder, but came back when you put anti-correlation in. We saw that in the presence of quantum phase transition, the disorder effects can be very stark. Very stark. In fact, you can show that in certain cases, the effect of disorder near quantum phase transition can be such that it smears the transition. I haven't talked about that. We've seen how these rare regions that come about because of disorder, how they're correlated in infinite dimension, at an infinite extent in imaginary time, and how this leads to anomalous behavior of observables. And so finally, before we end, certain things that I have not talked about with respect to disorder and condensed matter systems is about in 2 dimensions, as you all know, and lower, as you all know, if you have infinitesimal amount of disorder, all states are localized and rendered insulating because of Anderson localization effects, right? The question that has always been at the forefront is whether interactions can delocalize it. So we have something that we have been working on with what are called a spin selected disorder with Sashi and Prabuddha, who's from ISI Bangalore. We have some very nice results on vacancy disorder in graphene. So that was some time ago. Last year, I had some work using this ADS CMT mapping, and we described a disordered system through that and looked at entanglement entropy. Very recently, we have a FISREV-D on many body localizations where the disorder is dynamically generated. So we start with a non-disordered Hamiltonian, and we drive it, and the driving actually produces disorder, and then you go to a many body localized space. So maybe some of this I can talk about when I come to Mumbai once this epidemic gets over. So thank you for your attention, and I'm really sorry if I have run over time. Thank you very much.